الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا علما وعملا يا رب العالمين. أما بعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it's good to be back in Neeli Masjid again. This is, I think, my third or fourth time here now with the brothers. And mashallah, it's, every time it's actually a good series. So there's a nice series going on, and I'm asked to give one of the lectures. And mashallah, this series of the lives of the Anbiya, or lessons from the lives of the Anbiya, is actually very important. Very important, especially for us in today's day and age. When we are living at a time in which we don't really have any connection with the Anbiya. We don't really know much about them, who they were, any details about their lives, etc. So it's good that such a halaqah has been organized to educate ourselves about the lives of these Anbiya and what lessons we can take from them. Just before we actually get into the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, because this is the first lecture in the series, I wanted to just share a few reasons why it's important to study the lives of the prophets. Firstly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَقَصُصِ الْقَصَصَ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, that narrate their stories so that they may reflect, so that the people may reflect. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He commands the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Quran to narrate the stories of these Anbiya, to narrate the stories of these prophets of the past. Why? There's a reason behind it. That reason is so that the people may reflect, the people may ponder, the people may take lessons from their lives. So this is the first reason. Secondly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about the Anbiya in the Quran. And He says to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَى اللَّهُ فَبِهُدَاهُ مُقْتَدِهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran that it is these people, i.e. the prophets, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has guided, who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given guidance to. So follow them, follow their way, follow their guidance, follow the lessons that they left behind. So again, this is a command by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He is telling us in this ayah that they are the people who should be followed. They are the people who you should take as role models. Today, unfortunately, we see many of the youth, if you ask them about Ronaldo, they'll tell you everything you need to know about Ronaldo. If you ask them about Rooney, they'll tell you everything you need to know about Rooney. Messi, Suarez, they'll tell you everything about the footballers, anything about the cricketers, anything about the actors. But if we ask them about the Anbiya, they know very little, because we have not taken them as our role models. And of course this is the fault of the community at large, because we've not educated our youth on who these people were, why it's important to learn about them and study their lives. Number three, when we start to study the lives of these Anbiya, we inculcate a love for them in our hearts. You can't love somebody if you don't know anything about them. We all claim to love the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We all claim to love Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam. But how true is that love if we know nothing about these prophets? If we know nothing about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how can we say we love him? We just love somebody we don't know anything about? This isn't the way of the believers. So we learn about these prophets, so inshallah we can inculcate love within our hearts for them. Lastly, we study their lives because, like I said before, in their lives there are great lessons we can derive and apply to our situations today. And when we study their lives, it puts things into perspective for us. When we see the difficulties that the Anbiya went through, when we see the trials and tribulations they faced. Today we'll look at some of the trials that Ibrahim a.s. faced, the trials that the Prophet ﷺ faced, the trials and tribulations that Musa a.s. faced. All these difficulties that these Anbiya faced, it puts into perspective the trials and tribulations that we have today. That really we're not tried and tested to that same level. And even if we were tried and tested, some people say, look at the people in Gaza, look at the people in Syria, what's happening to them. we should all realize that they are following the sunnah of the Anbiya. Because it is the sunnah of the Anbiya to be tested. It is the sunnah of the Anbiya to go through trials and difficulties and tribulations. So these are some of the reasons why it's important for us to learn about the lives of the Prophets alayhimu salatu wassalam. Again, just before going into the actual story, some people often ask what's the difference between a prophet and a messenger, a nabi and a rasul. So what's the difference? Any ideas? If I just keep talking, people are going to fall asleep. So we need to get some interaction. Right? What are some ideas of or the differences between a nabi and a rasul, a prophet and a messenger? No?
A Rasul had a new message to give to the people, and Nabi followed
Yes.
a different Rasul's message.
Yeah, so the Rasul, he came with a message, he came with a new law, a shariah. Whereas the Prophet, the Nabi, he followed the previous shariah. So was every Rasul a prophet, or was every prophet a Rasul? Every Rasul was a prophet, yeah? I think you guys have eaten too much today, or I don't know what's going on. So every Rasul was a prophet. So every messenger was a prophet, but not every prophet was a messenger, because not every prophet came with a new law. In the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, it states that there was 120,000 prophets, and there's a different narration as well. But in this hadith, it states that there was 120,000 prophets, and of them 315 were messengers, were Rasuls. So okay, moving on inshallah to the story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. The story of Ibrahim alayhi salam, or the mention of Ibrahim alayhi salam, is made in the Quran more than 70 times. More than 70 times in 25 different surahs, in 25 different surahs. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, subhanallah, he is that prophet who is accepted by all. He is like the most praised by all the faiths. The Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, they all agree on the lofty nature and the status of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was born into a house of idolaters. So he was born into a house of people who worshipped idols. And his father, Azhar, he was actually one of the people who used to make idols. So his father was actually one of the people who used to make idols. And this is the situation, the context he was born into. A time where people were just worshipping idols. There was nobody who worshipped Allah. There was this concept of monotheism did not exist at that time. There was nobody. And from a young age, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he couldn't get his head around this idol worshipping. He couldn't get his head around it. He said that, he used to say, and he used to see his father making these idols. And then when his father had finished making the idols, he would often play with them. And he would be, in some narrations, in some of the books of history, even Khidr, etc., they state that he would be playing with them, and sometimes he'd be kicking them around, etc. And then afterwards he would see some people worshipping these idols. So to him it couldn't make sense that these idols, they can't do anything. They can't do anything, literally. They have no power, they can't even defend themselves. Yet all the people are worshipping these idols. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he says to his father, he says, Ya abati, lima ta'budu ma la yasma'u wa la yubsiru wa la yughni anka shay'a. He asks his father, he says, oh my father, and the way he addresses him is very important. Because in Arabic, if you want to say, oh my father, you just say, Ya abi, oh my father. But when you say, Ya abati, it shows that higher level of respect, that higher level of love and affection. So he says to his father, Ya abati. He's saying, why are you worshipping those things that they can't hear? They can't speak. They can't do anything for you. These idols that you're worshipping, literally, they can't do anything for you. They can't give you any benefit. They can't even benefit themselves. But as a father, the father of Ibrahim alayhi, he refused. Azhar. Of course, he was into idol worshipping. The whole community, the whole society was into idol worshipping, and he was never going to accept what Ibrahim alayhi said. So Ibrahim alayhi, he left his father, and then he moved on to the community. He moved on to the general people, and he wanted to see, and wanted to speak to them, have a dialogue with them, try to explain to them that this idol worshipping is wrong. So he used to converse with them, and time went past, and he used to, ask them questions that they can't even speak, they can't do anything. Why are you worshipping them? But they used to say, he's just a little kid, we won't pay any attention to him. So one day, there was an annual festival which took place. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he came up with a plan. He said that I'm going to stay here, I'll say I'm sick, I'll stay here. And when the people go out, when they go now to this festival, which was out of town, I'm going to go and break all the idols. So the people leave, and he's the only one left. And he sees all the idols, he goes up to the idols and he asks them, can you speak, can you eat, etc. And obviously the idols aren't replying. So what he does then is he breaks all the idols. So he smashes all the idols except one. And then it's mentioned in the Quran that he smashes the idols. And then what he does is he leaves that one and he puts the axe, which isn't mentioned in the Quran, this is mentioned in the other books, that he leaves the axe hanging on the head of the biggest idol. So he wants to show them a lesson. He wants them to think, He's trying to get them to actually think. So he breaks all the idols, he leaves the axe hanging on the neck of the biggest idol, and he goes away. So now the people return after coming back from their festival. And now obviously they're shocked. Their gods, literally the actual things that they worshipped have been destroyed. They've been smashed into pieces. Who did this? And then they remember that there was a young boy who's always insulting our gods. He's always, cursing and telling us we shouldn't be worshipping these gods. It must have been him. So they call for Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, he comes. And now the people are gathered and they ask him, did you do this? Who did this? Who broke our idols? And Ibrahim alayhi salam, he says it was the biggest one. It was the bigger one. Ask him. He's your God, ask him. He'll tell you what happened. But of course, they realize that, the God can't do anything. This pretend God that they have, or this idol that they have, he can't do anything. This idol literally can't speak, it can't even defend itself, either could the other little ones. So they realize that, they realize the game that Ibrahim alayhi salam is trying to play. And the ulama, they say that they actually realize that, these idols can't do anything. But their pride stopped them from accepting what Ibrahim alayhi salam was saying. Their pride actually stopped them. So what did they do next? They said that he's insulted our gods. We have to take revenge. So they said, let's build a big fire. So now the people gather around and they start bringing firewood. Ibn Kathir, he states, they start bringing firewood from everywhere. And they dig a pit. And they start filling this pit up with firewood. And then they build the fire and they light the fire. And in the narrations it says the fire was so big, it was as if it was touching the sky. That the birds would not go above it in fear of being burnt. And this was a massive fire and the people gathered around. So they said, we're going to throw Ibrahim alayhi salam into this fire. So now as the people have gathered, they tie Ibrahim alayhi salam up in chains, his hands, his legs, they take him to the catapult. And they throw him into this fire. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, Ibn Abbas, he actually states that Ibrahim alayhi salam, as this is happening, he actually keeps reciting, Hasbi Allah wa ni'mal wakeel, that Allah is sufficient for me, and He is enough of a protector. And what a good protector He is. And he is catapulted into the fire. And then what happens? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْنَا يَا نَارُ كُونِي بَرْدًا وَسَلَامًا عَلَى إِبْرَاهِيمَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the fire. We all know, what does the fire do? The fire, it burns. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands this very fire which burns people. He commands it to be bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim, to be coolness, to be a source of peace, tranquility for Ibrahim. So just as he's going into this fire, and obviously the people are expecting him to burn now and to die, that becomes a source of peace. And in some narrations it says that only his chains were actually touched and affected by the fire, and he came out peacefully. So what are some of the lessons from this aspect of this part of the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam? The life of Ibrahim, we can talk for hours about his life, but we want to just mention some lessons from certain periods of his life, or certain incidents of his life. The first lesson is that we see Ibrahim alayhi salam, he stood up for the truth. Ibrahim alayhi salam stood up for the truth. And how many people supported him? How many people did he have behind him? Not even one. By himself, young man, believed in the oneness of Allah, and what does he do? He stands up against his whole community. Because he knew he was on the haqq. He knew he was on the truth. At a very young age. This shows us that when we have what we have as Islam, when we have La ilaha illallah, that we should be firm upon this. We should not waver. And this was not the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam. By himself, a young man, no support, but he stood firm on La ilaha illallah. And he broke away from the traditions of his father. Today, you ask some of our families, and this happens a lot, even in my family, why are you doing certain practices? Why are you doing such and such? Why are you doing X, Y, and Z? Certain practices which aren't from Islam. The common reply is that our fathers used to do it. This is what our parents used to do. Are you trying to say that they did something wrong? But this is not the way of the Anbiya. This is not the way of the Muslims. We have a shariah, we have a way. We use our minds, we use our intellect. Is something right, is something wrong? We don't just blindly follow and say that this is what our fathers used to do. And this is what the people said to Ibrahim alayhi salam. They said, وَجَدَنَا آبَاءَنَا لَهَا عَابِدِينَ. That we found our parents, آبَاءَنَا لَهَا عَابِدِينَ. That they used to be worshipping these same idols. This is why we do it. But this is not, again, this was not the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So it shows us that we shouldn't blindly follow. We shouldn't just blindly follow what we have been taught. Rather, we should use our minds. The second lesson from that incident that we can take is look at the tawakkul of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he has been catapulted into the fire. As he's been taken there, he could have said anything to try and get out of it. He could have said, okay, I renounce this religion or anything. But he had tawakkul that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would look after him. He had tawakkul that whatever happens is from Allah. So even in one narration it's actually mentioned that as he's being catapulted, Jibreel alayhi salam comes to him. And Jibreel alayhi salam, he asks Ibrahim, he says, "Oh Ibrahim, is there anything you wish for?" Now if that was any of us, what are we going to wish for? Oh, save me, or get me out of this situation. But what was the reply of Ibrahim alayhi salam? Ibrahim alayhi salam, he could have said, save me from the fire, take me away. But what did he reply? He says, I only wish for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with me. I only wish for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be pleased with me. Whatever happens now, that's my only wish, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with me. So then shortly after this incident, we see a very famous story that we all know of and we've all heard of takes place. And that's the story or the dialogue between Ibrahim alayhi salam and the king, Nimrod. And this is recorded at the end of Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِي حَاجَّ إِبْرَاهِيمَ فِي رَبِّهِ أَنْ آتَاهُ اللَّهُ الْمُلْكَ إِذْ قَالَ إِبْرَاهِيمُ رَبِّيَ الَّذِي يُحْيِي وَيُمِيتُ قَالَ أَنَا أُحْيِي وَأُمِيتُ قال إبراهيم فإن الله يأتي بالشمس من المشرق فأتي بها من المغرب فبهت الذي كفر والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. So shortly after this incident where he comes out of the fire, he meets with this king. And this king Nimrod, in the books of history it's mentioned, his name, he is now the king of the people of Babylon. And Babylon is like modern day Iraq. And there's a dialogue which occurs, and he's heard about this young man who's going around saying that there's only one God, etc., etc. So he's polluting the minds of the people. So the king, he calls for Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam is still a young boy. So now the dialogue takes place. And he says, who's this Lord that you're talking about? So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he says he's the one who gives life and causes death. So the king says, I can do the same. I can give life and cause death. So he calls for two people. And one of them was due to be sentenced to death, and the other one was a free man. So the one who was due to be sentenced to death, he lets him go. And the one who was a free man, he kills him. And he says, look, I have given life and I have taken death. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he says that my Lord makes the sun rise from the east and set in the west. He says, if you're really the Lord, then you make it rise from the west. And of course now the king, he has no reply. Because he has no power, he can't do anything. And بُهِتَ الَّذِي كَفَرَ. And they became dumbfounded. And he was beaten at his own game. He thought, I've tried to, in front of the people, show this little boy up. But Ibrahim alayhi salam, he showed the people that this was not a true king and that the true king was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see from this that look at the logic of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Look how logical he was. And he was a teacher. If you look, and alhamdulillah, I'm a teacher by profession, you see some of these instances and these incidents in the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam. The other one where he's reclining and he's looking at the star and he's saying, this is my Lord, and then when it sets, it disappears, he says, no, it can't be, and then the same with the sun and the moon. And he's doing this, he knows who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, but he's trying to show the people. He's trying to show them that, look, actually these things can't be God. God is the one that never goes, never disappears, never sleeps. Al-Hayy al-Qayyum. So he's trying to show the people, by example. And this is again what he does here. Another lesson we take from this specific incident is that look at the firmness of Ibrahim alayhi salam. That he went and delivered the message to the king. The king, the most powerful man, but Ibrahim alayhi salam stood firm. He didn't just, in front of the king start mushing his words and not knowing what to say and just go with what the people say. No, he stood firm. He delivered the message. And this is something that the Muslims, we have to be. When we talk about da'wah and we talk about delivering the message, we should be firm in our message. We shouldn't be wavering about when we're in front of somebody who has a bit of status. So that was the second incident or point that I wanted to mention. So, even after these incidents, the people still didn't believe. Even after being shown, the logically the arguments, even after Ibrahim alayhi salam comes out of the fire unscathed, the people still will not follow his way. So then he decides to do hijrah. And the ulama say that the first person ever to have done hijrah for the sake of Allah was Ibrahim alayhi salam. Inni mahajirun ila rabbi, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. So he did hijrah for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at that time, there was no group of believers. There was Ibrahim alayhi salam, Sarah, who later became his wife, and his nephew Lut alayhi salam. Lut was his nephew, the son of his brother. So they now decide to travel and leave Babylon, and they go to Syria, Palestine, trying to deliver the message, trying to share the message of Islam with the people. And then they come to Egypt. And in Egypt, they were given Hajar alayhi salam as a slave, as a servant. And by this time, Sarah alayhi salam, she knew that she couldn't give birth. She couldn't give birth to any progeny. So what she did was she actually gifted or allowed Ibrahim alayhi salam, and told Ibrahim alayhi salam to marry Hajar alayhi salam, and gifted Hajar to Ibrahim alayhi salam. And through Hajar and Ibrahim, we have the Prophet Ismail. The Prophet Ismail was born through Ibrahim alayhi salam and Hajar. And some people, they often think it was Sarah. It wasn't actually Sarah. Ishaq alayhi salam was born through Sarah. And that's ajib, because at that time she thought, I can't have children. And what was most important to her? Most important thing to her was that the message still carried on. Because Ibrahim alayhi salam was very old in age. He was over 85 years old. So what was most important to her was that the message carried on. So, she put her feelings to the side and allowed Ibrahim alayhi salam and Hajar to have Ismail. And even, subhanallah, look, later on, 14 years later, in some of the books it's mentioned, Sarah alayhi salam, she actually gives birth to Ishaq. So then we have Ibrahim alayhi salam, he's a young child. And the next famous incident which takes place is when Ibrahim alayhi salam, he takes his Hajar and he takes Ismail, and he tells them that I'm going to take you on a journey, get your things ready. So they get their things ready, they don't know where they're going, and they start traveling with Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam takes them through the deserts until they reach what we know today as modern day Mecca, the area of the Kaaba and Safa wal Marwa, these mountains. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, subhanallah, he leaves his wife Hajar and Ismail there. Ismail, a young baby, leaves them with what? A little bit of water and some dates. And imagine the scene, that he's taking his wife and he's taking his young child. He's over 85 years old now, and he's got this baby, finally he's got a child. But he takes them and he leaves them in modern day, present day Mecca as we know it. And he turns around and he starts to walk away. Now Hajar alayhi salam, she doesn't know what's going on. He's saying, and so she starts to ask Ibrahim. He said that you're leaving us in a place with no food, with nothing, and there's nobody here. And Ibrahim alayhi salam, he remains quiet. He carries on walking. Then she asks him again. Again, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he remains quiet. She asks him for a third time. You're leaving us in this place. There's nobody here. There's no food, and you're going. And then she asks him, did your Lord command you to do this? And Ibrahim alayhi salam says yes. And then she says, our Lord will take care of us. And then she goes back. So Ibrahim alayhi salam, he carries on walking until he's out of sight. He can't now see Hajar and his son. And he turns around to the place where the Kaaba is today. And he makes the famous dua. And subhanAllah, we'll spend a few moments looking at this dua. He makes the dua, again, which is recorded in the Quran, and which was recited by our young brother. رَبَّنَا إِنِّي أَسْكَنْتُ مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِي بِوَادٍ غَيْرِ ذِي زَرْعٍ عند بيتك المحرم ربنا ليقيموا الصلاة فاجعل أفئدة من الناس تهوي إليهم وارزقهم من الثمرات لعلهم يشكرون. And if you look at this dua, subhanallah, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he's left his family. Literally, he's left his family in a desert. He doesn't know what's going to happen to them. He's been commanded by Allah to leave his family there. And he turns around and he makes this dua. And what would any of us ask for? In this dua, when we're making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've just left our family in the middle of nowhere with absolutely no provisions apart from a few dates. We don't know what's going to happen to them. The first thing we're going to make dua is, oh Allah, look after them. This is the first thing we're going to make dua. Oh Allah, look after them. Oh Allah, protect them. Oh Allah, let no harm come to them. But what is the first thing Ibrahim alayhi salam makes dua? He says, oh Allah, liyuqimu salah. Make them people who establish the prayer. Make them people who establish the prayer. And again, we see that Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he's actually building the Kaaba, he makes the famous dua, Rabbi ja'alni muqimu salah wa min dhurriyyati. He makes the same similar dua. He says, oh Allah, make me from the people who establish the prayer and my progeny. And if we think about that, that should illustrate to us how important the prayer is. How important the prayer is. Ibrahim, the first thing he asks for is that they become people who establish the salah. When he's building the Kaaba, he makes dua, oh Allah, Rabbi ja'alni muqimu salah. Make me from those people who perform the salah. Salah, salah. When Musa alayhi salam was lost in the desert, and he's with his wife, and he sees a fire in the distance, sees some light. So he's lost in the desert. He says to his wife, he says, there must be people over there, wait here, let me go to where this light's coming from, and I'll get some provisions, I'll get some directions to where we need to go. So he goes towards that light. And at that very moment when he gets there, he sees nobody. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to Musa alayhi salam directly. And what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? إِنَّنِي أَنَا اللَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنَا فَاعْبُدْنِي وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِي. The very first conversation between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Musa alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I am Allah. La ilaha illa ana fa'budni, worship me, wa aqim as-salata li dhikri. And establish the prayer for my remembrance. The very first conversation between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Musa alayhi salam. If we look at Isa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, we all know the miraculous nature of his birth. His mother Maryam, she was known to be from the most devout and pious women of Jerusalem. And her story is well known. She disappears for a few days, and then she returns carrying a baby. So Maryam alayhi salam, she disappears for a few days, nobody knows where she's gone, and she comes back and she's carrying a baby. And the people are shocked, so they start to assume the worst. And she couldn't speak because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told her not to speak for 3 days. So what happens next? The infant boy, Isa alayhi salam, he starts to speak. And Isa alayhi salam, and this is again recorded in the Quran. He says, قال إني عبد الله آتاني الكتاب وجعلني نبيا. Again, this infant boy, he starts to speak and he says, I am the slave of Allah. Allah has given me the book and He's made me a prophet. Infant boy, miracle. He's speaking from the arms of his mother. And then he carries on, وجعلني مباركا أينما كنت وأوصاني بالصلاة والزكاة ما دمت حيا. And he says, Allah has made me blessed wherever I may be. And He has commanded me, enjoined upon me, the salah and the zakah as long as I live. The salah and the zakah as long as I live. Isa alayhi salam, a baby in the arms of his mother, he is telling the people that I have been commanded with the salah and zakah as long as I live. This should really be making us think that these anbiya, all of them came with the salah. Ibrahim alayhi salam is making dua, make me from the people who establish the prayer. Musa alayhi salam, in the first conversation with Allah, Allah is telling him what? That establish the prayer for my remembrance. Isa alayhi salam, the first thing that he speaks, he's saying that I've been commanded with the prayer as long as I live. And we come to the final prophet, Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. How was the salah given to him? How was the salah given to him? We all know that the injunctions in the Quran all came down. The Quran came down, Jibreel alayhi salam would come with the prohibitions, with the orders and the commands. But there was one action where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala invited the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam up to the heavens, which is known in the famous incident of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he's taken by Jibreel alayhi salam up through the different heavens. And they're going through the heavens and they're meeting the different Anbiya. And then they get to a place where Jibreel alayhi salam says, I can't go any further. You have to go by yourself. So the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he carries on going. And then he meets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what was this important conversation? Why was the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam invited up to meet Allah? What was the command that was so important that the Prophet was invited up to the heavens for? It was the salah. And we all know that originally the Prophet, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he told the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, your ummah has to pray 50 salah. And this was a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the ummah, that you can pray 50 salah. So now the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam is coming back down the heavens. And he meets Musa alayhi salam. And Musa alayhi salam, he asks, what have you been commanded with? What have you been given? And he said, 50 salah. And Musa alayhi salam said, I know the people, this is too much. Too much. Go back up and ask for less. So this kept happening, and every time it would get lower and lower, 5 down, 5 down, 5 down, until it became 5. And in some of the narrations it's mentioned that they would get the reward for 50. Look at the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is, we see first and foremost from the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam, that he wanted to be from those people who established the salah. He wanted his wife, he wanted his children to be from those people who established the salah. The other anbiya, we see from their conversations with Allah, are commanded with the salah. The salah is so important, and it's much neglected by the Muslims today. Really, we see that, sometimes we think it's an excuse. I'm busy, I'm at work, I'm busy with other things, shopping, these things, I can't fit the salah in. And that's because we don't understand what the salah is. The salah is a conversation between us and Allah. In the very famous Hadith Qudsi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that after we say Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds, he says, Hamidani Abdi, that my slave has praised me. And then when we say Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim Maliki Yawmiddin, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds, Majjadani Abdi, that my slave has exalted me. And it's a communication, a conversation, an opportunity we have to converse with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we should never think that the salah is something minute. And this was, we first see this in the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam. And even when we look at the hadith, and the reason I mention the salah is because although we're talking about Ibrahim, we've seen how it links in with Ibrahim, how we make dua to be from the people who established the salah. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because it's so much neglected amongst the Muslims today. Just the other day, I met a brother, and he was asking me, he said to me, because I'm so busy at work, what I do is, and he works evening shifts, so he says, what I do is I just combine Asr, Maghrib and Isha when I come home from work at 11 o'clock. Is this okay? So, subhanAllah, and alhamdulillah, he's somebody who's still trying to do something, he's still trying to pray. Unfortunately, we have Muslims who completely neglect the prayer altogether. Unfortunately, even within our families, there are people who do not pray the salah. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, بَيْنَ الرَّجُلِ وَبَيْنَ الْكُفْرِ تَرْكُ الصَّلَاةِ, that between a man and disbelief is the leaving of salah. Ibn Mas'ud, he would say that the one who does not pray, he has no deen. The one who does not pray, he has no deen. In one hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he grabbed Mu'adh bin Jabal, and he was actually taking Mu'adh bin Jabal, and they were walking. And he said to him, shall I not inform you of Ra's al-Amr? Shall I not inform you of the head of all matters? And Mu'adh bin Jabal, he said, of course. The Prophet ﷺ said that the Ra's al-Amr is al-Islam. وَعَمُودُهُ, and its pillar, as-salah. The pillar of your Islam is as-salah. So if you have no Islam, if you have no salah, then what is your Islam based on? Really, so this is something that we should never, we should always take this opportunity, or an opportunity to remind ourselves, to remind our families, to remind our communities of the important nature of the salah. It should never be overlooked. You know, it's the bedrock, really, it's the bedrock of our deen. Moving on, going back to the story of Ibrahim. So after a while, you know, we know that Ibrahim alayhi salam, he left Hajar and Ismail in Mecca, and now obviously Hajar alayhi salam, she's got no water, she's got no, you know, the food running out. Ismail alayhi salam's crying. Look, imagine the situation. She's worried, you know, they've got nothing. So she starts running between these two mountains that we know as As-Safa wal Marwa today. And subhanAllah, today, over 4,000 years, 4,000 years after that incident took place, today we are commemorating the actions of Hajar alayhi salam. When we do our Umrah and our Hajj and we go through Safa wal Marwa. So she's running back and forth trying to see if there's anybody there. She gets to the top of Marwa, she looks, she can't find anybody. She comes down, she goes to the top of Safa, she can't see, she can't find anybody. She does this 7 times. And she's now obviously, she's in a state where she doesn't know what to do. And then all of a sudden Jibreel alayhi salam descends. And Jibreel alayhi salam starts to dig the well, starts to dig the earth. And from that earth, water starts gushing out. The miracle of Zamzam as we know today. The water of Zamzam, which subhanAllah, over 4,000 years ago, started coming from the earth and it's still going. And it will carry on going to the Day of Judgment. And the water comes out and she tries to make it into a well. And obviously now she's got water, and then eventually a tribe called Jurhum, were close by, and then they moved in, and the Prophet Ibrahim Ismail alayhi salam, he grew up with them, he learnt language with them, he learnt a lot of things from them, and his mother Hajar alayhi salam, she passed away. So after many years, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he comes back to find his son. I'm just cutting everything short now because the time's coming to an end. So after many years, he comes back and he finds his son Ismail. Now imagine the situation. You've been away. You're now over 95 years and over 100 years old. And you come back to see this son who you've not seen for such a long time. And the love of a father, anyone who's a parent knows the love that you have in your heart for your children. So now he comes back and he sees Ismail alayhi salam. Ismail alayhi salam's grown up. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to put him and put them both to a test, to see whose love is more. Is the love for your children more, or is the love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more? And we all know the famous incident which took place. Ibrahim alayhi salam, he sees a dream. And in this dream he's sacrificing his son Ismail. So the next day he goes to Ismail and he says, I've seen in a dream that I'm sacrificing you. What do you think? What's your opinion? And he says, Ismail says, If'al ma tu'mar. Do what you're commanded. Satajiduni insha'Allahu min as-sabirin. That you will find me from the patient ones. Insha'Allah, you will find me from the patient ones. Do what you're commanded. He knows that death is awaiting. Potentially now death is awaiting. This is what Ibrahim is saying. I've seen in a dream I'm sacrificing you. Ismail, he says, do as you're commanded, you will find me from the patient ones. So Ismail alayhi salam, Ibrahim gets Ismail. And imagine, look at the test. It's not just, and he has to kill his son. But look at the test. He has to grab a knife. He has to lay his son on the floor. Imagine as a parent, a child you've not seen for so long. You place him on the floor. You have the knife in your hand. And now you're ready to sacrifice your son. So as he's about to make that sacrifice, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees where the choice was made. He sees that they've all submitted. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replaces Ismail, and a sheep comes down, a ram, and the sacrifice is made. And this is why today, when we go on Hajj and we make the udhiyah, we do that in commemoration of this act of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So we see that throughout the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam, he was faced with many tests, many trials, many tribulations. And we see that one of the things that really comes through in his life is the tawakkul he had in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That whatever he was commanded to do, he was ready to do it. He had that true belief and reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever situation he was in, whether it's going and being thrown into a fire, whether it's now time to sacrifice your son, whether you're in front of a king and potentially facing death, he was always somebody who submitted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and had that tawakkul and reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he was also the one who built the Kaaba, again recorded in Surah Al-Baqarah, that him and his son Ismail, later on, they were the ones who established the Kaaba, which today is frequented by all of us. From that time till the Day of Judgment, everybody who does tawaf around the Kaaba do tawaf around the Kaaba, which was built by Ibrahim alayhi salam and his son. It went through renovations and changes as the years passed by. I think I'll end it there. And we've covered some of the major incidents in his life, and we've taken some of the lessons from these incidents. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who truly follow the way of the Anbiya and truly follow the way of Ibrahim alayhi salam and the progeny that came after him. Because we see that all the Anbiya that came after Ibrahim were from his progeny. Ismail, Ishaq, they all came through them. There was nobody who came that was not from the progeny of Ibrahim alayhi salam. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who follow these Anbiya and learn true lessons from their life that we can implement into our life. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.